Good afternoon. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development, also director of the U.S. Development Policy Program at the Center. And it's my pleasure to be welcoming you to our session this afternoon on U.S. foreign assistance reform. I have the easy job of just providing the welcoming, and I'll be turning it over very shortly to our moderator for this panel, which is both an excellent panel and a large panel, as you see by the chairs. And I would say that the size of the panel, both for a number of reasons and for at least one good reason, which is I think something that it strikes me as from where we sit now in September of this year, a little bit of a pleasant surprise in that in a year when it comes to foreign assistance, it has felt very fraught and perilous with very deep proposed budget cuts, program eliminations, even agency eliminations. In reaction to that, I think what we are seeing, certainly in the think tank world and the advocacy world, is some very good thinking about how to respond and what that will mean for aid going forward, but also what reform can look like in this environment. And that's what we're trying to capture here this afternoon with representatives from really the major efforts around thinking about aid reform. And it's really, we're pleased to be hosting this panel because I think all of the reports and the thinking that you'll hear about today really reflects strong, honest efforts to do a number of things that we always try to do in our work here at the center, which is to apply careful scrutiny to what exists in the status quo, where it works, be willing to say that it works and defend it. Where it doesn't work, be willing to say that, and always be looking for opportunities to innovate and reform so that we can make development assistance more effective. So I'm excited by the reports and the soon-to-be reports that we'll hear about this afternoon. I know it's going to be an excellent panel. I'm done with my easy job. I'm now turning it over to Cindy Huang, Senior Policy Fellow here at the Center, who will be moderating this session, trying to squeeze in a lot of good thinking into a short amount of time. Cindy comes to us. Don't get up yet. I'm just going to say a little bit more about you. Cindy comes to us from senior policy positions in the U.S. government, both at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, at the State Department, and herself as one of the co-authors of one of the reports we'll hear about today, brings a lot of good insight as a moderator. So with that, all of you come on up and we'll get started.
Yeah, go ahead. Great. Thanks so much to all of you here, and thanks to Scott for being the leader of our U.S. Development Policy Initiative here at the Center for Global Development. It's really exciting to see such a big crowd here, and hello and welcome to everyone who's here on the live webcast as well. So as Scott mentioned, this is an exciting time for elevating, highlighting, articulating ideas for reform. And this panel is extremely timely because, as most of you are probably aware, the proposals from the agencies to OMB are due in just 2 days. So hopefully some people are tuning in and see this as an opportunity to pick up some ideas in the last minutes. And also there have been some strong signals recently from both the House and the Senate that they expect that there will be further robust discussion on ways to strengthen our development and diplomacy capacities. So we do have this amazing and august panel here today. I'll just do some very quick introductions and we'll jump right in and save time at the end for questions. So at the far end, Errol Yaboke, who's Deputy Director and Fellow at the Project on U.S. Leadership and Development at CSIS and co-author of Reforming and Reorganizing U.S. Foreign Assistance. Next to him, Nilmini Rubin, a Vice President at Tetra Tech and member of the CSI Task Force. Then Jeremy Konyndyk, Senior Policy Fellow here at CGD and co-author of A Practical Vision for U.S. Development Reform. We wrote the paper together, but he knows he's not getting any extra time as a result. And then Jim Roberts, Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth at the Heritage Foundation and co-author of a forthcoming report on foreign aid reform. And George Ingram, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network co-chair and co-author of A New Foreign Aid Architecture, Fit for Purpose. Unfortunately, Karen Hanrahan, who was a co-author of the Atlantic Council's State Department Reform Report, could not be with us here today due to an emergency, but hopefully during the question and answer period, we'll have a chance to engage in some of the ideas presented there. Okay, so I also have the unenviable job of managing the time so that we have a robust discussion along a variety of dimensions. So I might raise my hand here or there, but really appreciate, again, all of you being here. And we have a lightning round at the beginning so that you can get an overview of the scope and the motivation behind each of these reports. So let me start with Errol to tell us about the CSIS report.
Excellent. Thanks, Cindy, and thanks to CGD for hosting. It's a very timely and topical conversation that we're having. So in response to President Trump's executive order back in March about increased efficiency and effectiveness and accountability that he wanted out of the federal government, we put together a high-level bipartisan task force co-chaired by Senator Todd Young of Indiana and Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. The idea was to get senior former USAID, State Department, Capitol Hill, just really the premier experts in the field. And my job was the unenviable one of trying to consolidate all the experts like Nilmani's thoughts into a cohesive report, which you can see outside. I brought a few copies. So I think a lot of our motivations are probably aligned in terms of why we did these exercises. So I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about chapters 1 through, I think it was 3 in the report, which talks about why we should actually be doing this. Other than to say that our angle was that it's not just about pure altruism, it's about smart investments in national security and prosperity. It's based on a belief that the best foreign assistance policy has at its core an enlightened self-interest and a desire to effect positive change. So both of those things in one. The Trump skinny budget was not that. The Trump skinny budget has dollar amounts that are not really in the U.S. national interest, in our estimation. And the numbers were driving strategy and organization as opposed to the reverse. So based on a belief that reform is actually needed, but what was presented by the administration would not get us there, we put together a series of recommendations. The first recommendation, and I won't go into too much detail, it's available online and again here. The first one is to maintain USAID as an independent agency, that we should develop a cohesive development strategy for the government, and that the USAID administrator should serve as the coordinator of all U.S. foreign assistance. The second recommendation addressed duplication of effort. I hope we get a chance to talk about some of those ideas later, but talking about transitioning aid, moving from aid to trade and things like that. The third is a little bit of the nuts and boltsy things that gets nerds like me going, but isn't exactly the, shall I say, sexiest things. Procurement, personnel reform, these are all critical things when you talk to experts in the field. But we did address them as well as some efforts in improving reporting. So I'll just leave it there, Cindy.
Great, thanks so much. Let me turn it over to George for an overview of the EMFAN proposal.
Thank you. And I'm going to focus very briefly on 3 EMFAN contributions to this discussion. And we got involved in this in early January, February, and in June released a set of principles to guide aid redesign, like having an independent, powerful aid agency with full authority on budget and policy, and that was accountable and transparent. Over 170 organizations and individuals have signed on to that now. We followed that up with our specific design proposal, And we decided that a disruptive time called for a bold proposal. And we have a two-pillar proposal. The first part is to bring all grant assistance programs into a single agency with a director that sits on the National Security Council and has cabinet status. And secondly, and pulling into that agency includes MCC and PEPFAR. The second pillar is development finance, pulling all of the development finance mechanism instruments, OPIC, TDA, DCA, into a single entity that has expanded authorities and has the ability to use its own resources. And thirdly, we've put out just recently, identified 10 commonalities across the various plans that have been put out there. And that, to us, is almost more significant than the specifics of our plan. That most of these plans are moving in the same direction is very significant. And I want to give 20 seconds of my time to Karen. I'm sorry she's not here, because the Atlantic Council report is a very constructive report. And while it focuses mainly on the State Department and ours mainly on AID, they both have the commonality of being focused on making both organizations more effective by being able to concentrate on their own missions. State Department on diplomacy, AID, or a new agency on development, by transferring a lot of states' programmatic programs over to AID.
Great, thank you so much. Jim, over to you.
Thanks. I'd like to meditate for a minute on the key question before us, the merger of state and USAID, or keeping USAID independent, as if the answer to the question of how 25 or more federal foreign aid agencies and programs that are too independent and uncoordinated can be solved by making AID more independent. Other countries have already merged their state and AID functions: Canada, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And that's what we would like to see. What does independent mean? Does it mean an AID that is above reproach, that has a permanent and unchallengeable long-term lock on congressional budgetary resources to end extreme poverty? That's certainly a worthy goal. Does it mean an AID that is immune from policy direction with which it might disagree? Does it mean an AID that resembles a pristine rulemaking law enforcement regulatory body such as the FCC, one that is never to be sullied by politics? Does it mean an AID that remains a small, standalone agency that is easier for contractors to deal with? It seems to me that when status quo defenders say independent USAID, what they really mean is a preeminent USAID. They want to make AID independent and have total control over the very tools, the foreign assistance resources, that were designed and approved by Congress for a theoretically, in their view, co-equal State Department to achieve diplomatic goals. They assert that AID has more expertise to solve thorny problems such as violent extremism than the State Department FSOs who have been hired and trained to work on those very problems. What about the whole of government and the tip of the spear approach? The defenders of status quo seem to imply that AID folks are tougher than those cocktail-swigging, cookie-pushing people at state who don't want to get their hands dirty. Yet today, hundreds of State Department assignments are now unaccompanied high-danger posts. So here's the problem. The formulation, delivery, oversight of foreign assistance is increasingly becoming one of the State Department's core functions. State has already steadily lost the lead to a host of other agencies. And I should know, I watched it happen for 25 years as a Foreign Service Officer. And it's a good thing. This is no longer 1947. State should not have the expertise in countless complicated issue areas. But the foreign assistance area is core, because that's where the money is. And money is how you influence people around the world and get their attention and achieve short-term U.S. national security objectives. And taxpayer money is a scarce resource in a city that just celebrated breaking through the $20 trillion federal debt ceiling. So the defenders of status quo say we need two State Departments with money and one without. And I disagree. We need one fully staffed, equipped, and resourced State Department, one Secretary of State, one ambassador in country. And then, since I'm running out of time, I'll meditate further on what the word development means later. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll look forward to the discussion because I would say that among these proposals, we don't have any strong defenders of the status quo. So I think it'll be interesting to hear the back and forth on that because it seems that all of these proposals are trying to ask more of the system at hand. So Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, Cindy. So our paper took a somewhat different approach from several of the others in that we didn't spend a lot of time focusing on the big picture questions of reorganization. We laid out some models of how that could work and expressed that generally we think that in whatever form the country does benefit from having a strong standalone development agency. I think Jim's point about understanding what we mean by independence is very well taken. And I think that's probably reconcilable with having a strong diplomatic function as well. I think it entirely is. But we didn't delve into that so much. We instead said, before you get into questions of which boxes to move where and merge with what, you need to understand or define what are we trying to achieve with our overseas development assistance. What are the core functions of our overseas development assistance, and then organize around that. And so we proposed 4. The first is, and these are a mix of U.S. interests, U.S. values, and U.S. comparative advantages. The 4 that we proposed were assisting fragile states. So how do you help the Central African Republic, South Sudans, and Somalias of the world to become the Ugandas and Kenyas and Nigerias of the world? The second was around inclusive growth. So recognizing that there's a whole set of countries now that aren't going to predominantly need foreign aid. Their development needs are different and are less about foreign assistance, though that has a role to play, and more about trade and private sector facilitation and U.S. convening power and the sort of things we do through the Power Africa program today, where the U.S. is mobilizing a whole range of tools that go well beyond just the provision of assistance. So how do you take the Nigerias, Kenyas, and Ugandas and turn those into the South Koreas of the world? We also propose then a focus on humanitarian assistance. That's a core capability and a core value for U.S. foreign policy. And finally, a focus on global health, which is a huge issue area. It's huge financially. It's something the U.S. does very, very well, and a core life-saving priority of U.S. foreign policy. So those were the 4 areas. And then we thought, so these big picture reforms, these macro reforms to the entire system are very ambitious, but they're going to take a long time, and there's a need to grease the skids. So we proposed 14 different ideas around those 4 priority organizing principles that could begin moving in that direction while Congress and the administration sort out what does the bigger picture look like, because that's not going to happen overnight. I won't go through all 14 now because I'm time limited, and you all can read, so I don't need to, I think. But just a couple. So we organized around those 4 areas that I've outlined. On global health, for example, proposing that USAID and CDC's roles under PEPFAR need to be reviewed and rationalized, that there is a duplication of capability there that could be better addressed. Under humanitarian response, there is structural duplication within USAID. There are 2 offices that do this on a food and non-food basis, one of which I used to run. Those should be put together into a new institution. This is immediately actionable, low-hanging fruit options to begin building momentum for reform, get some wins in, under the government's belt, and start laying the path for some bigger picture reforms. I also want to make a pitch for, as Errol said, the unsexy things. The unsexy plumbing of how foreign assistance works is really, really important to effectiveness. And many of the things that I think we bemoan as ineffective areas of U.S. foreign policy, and I just wrote a blog about this last week with respect to post-disaster reconstruction. The reason why some of these things don't function very well in our system often traces back to that unsexy plumbing. So things like HR reform, procurement and competition rules, and reporting and streamlining reporting, these are really important to effectiveness.
Great, thank Thank you so much. That's really helpful to get an overview, and you've started to hear some areas of consensus and where there's not very much consensus, and that will make for an exciting discussion. I first wanted to turn it over to Nilmani to comment on, I'd referenced that Congress really wants to be engaged on these questions. So for a few reflections on where you see Congress coming from, both the House and Senate, and how you think that will inform the discussions before us.
Thank you. I had the privilege of working for the House and the Senate, and I think what we like to say on the Hill is Congress is the continuity of government, and you have members that'll serve for 50 years and they are not only there for a long period of time, but Congress is a co-equal branch to the administration. As we look at development, we often just focus on the administration. We tend to forget that Congress is equal. And Congress is very powerful. It not only provides authorities in bills, either authorization bills or appropriations bills, but it also has the power of the purse. And Congress is waiving that right now. Just recently, on the House side, we had two appropriators, the lead Democrat and lead Republican appropriators, and the lead Democrat and Republican authorizers on the House side, Foreign Affairs and Appropriations, get together and write a letter to the administration saying, look, we want to be engaged early and often before you make any changes. We want to see the OMB submission that we talked about earlier that's going up on the 15th. We want to see that. And we want regular briefings on what you're planning. But Congress can go farther than that, and it certainly is showing that it will. So in the most recent version of the State Foreign Operations and related programs subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, they did a report. And in the report language that went with their bill, they actually referenced the CSIS report and talked about foreign aid reform and the need for them to stay in the loop and move forward. So Congress is watching, and I think when we look back to the budget submission from the administration, there wasn't a champion on the Hill for the new administration's budget that slashed foreign aid. And that's really important to remember, because it's, as we all know, it's hard to get anything through Congress, particularly if it doesn't have a champion, it's hard. So there is not a lot of energy around the administration's proposal, and Congress is kind of flexing both on authorizers and appropriators, Senate and House. The CSIS report was presented to senators. We had a really nice briefing with Senate staff and a number of Foreign Relations Committee senators about kind of what was in the report. And there was a lot of strong interest in foreign aid, but also just staying engaged. And they're thinking through how they can stay engaged best, whether that's letters or hearings or actual bills. But they're very much interested in being part of the process and actively authorizing changes.
Great, fantastic. Good. Well, you've heard a lot of the areas of consensus, but just wanted to review quickly so that we can dispense with them. And I think, Scott also referenced this, that I don't think any of us here are satisfied with the state of foreign assistance, that there is room for improvement. So some of the key themes that were highlighted were that there is too much fragmentation, more than 20 or 25 agencies implementing foreign assistance, that we need, and that there's the possibility of greater effectiveness and efficiency along a range of dimensions, HR, procurement, some of those were mentioned already, and that form should follow function. So I wanted to start by asking, so the proposals do differ in terms of the level of ambition and the lift it would take, and so I wanted to start with the CSIS report, both Errol and Nilmani, to comment on, you didn't propose the creation of a new agency. Instead, you talked about streamlining, moving some of the pots of assistance, some of the offices. And can you say why you ended up in that place of that being kind of the most also effective way to get the results that you think we need from foreign assistance?
I'll take a first stab at it, and if I miss anything, Nilmani, feel free to jump in. We very much were unified on the task force in the idea that the current system was inefficient. We came up with several lowest common denominator recommendations, I should say, one of which was when there is new assistance being discussed, Jim mentioned the 25 different agencies that are doing some form of foreign assistance. We had advocated for the creation of this coordinator of foreign assistance that's less, it's more of a joint chiefs of development style rather than a national security council sort of additional layer of bureaucracy. And we thought that the person that headed that, the USAID administrator who wears this hat as a coordinator, we thought that person should be the one to ultimately decide where that assistance should go, primarily USAID, unless there was a compelling reason to do otherwise. I'll just mention two other things very quickly. Since you talked about fragmentation, we encourage jointness in implementation of development assistance throughout the agencies. So a policy of secondments and personnel rotations and things that get people playing in the sandbox a little bit better together was definitely something that almost everybody in our task force was really unified behind. So I'll just leave it there and nobody.
I would only add that we did discuss it a lot, and there was debate about merging certain agencies together. And I think what we ended up coming down to was bigger's not always better. And some of these agencies the small agencies are lean and focused. And it was better to just have people like do what they do it well, and do it in the right direction than get everyone under the same tent.
Great, and I also wanted to mention that the Atlantic Council recommendations were very complementary and also talking about consolidating and streamlining, but not the creation of new agencies. And so then, Jim, I wanted to, you've already started to hint at some of your thoughts, but why, if you say a little bit more about the new agencies that would be created and why you think that would solve some of the effectiveness issues. And I was very intrigued by what you said about whole of government initiatives, and so why this structure would enable the use of these different tools and leveraging the various comparative advantages of the different components better.
I had a much easier task force to work with. It was just me and Brett Schaefer at Heritage. And we've been working hard, believe me, but we have a 20,000 word report that should be out soon. And the op-ed that I did recently, I think you got a copy of, outlines it. And so we certainly are not advocating for the creation of a new agency, actually. We're actually basically advocating for the abolition of an agency, which is the breakup of AID into two separate functions that are really very different. And one is health and humanitarian assistance, which we think should be in the State Department. And if PEPFAR is doing a great job at state, that becomes the go-to, organization within state for where this new AID that we call the U.S. Health and Humanitarian Assistance Agency, but within the State Department would go. If PRM is doing a good job, then they would do all the refugees, and there would be no more refugee work done by other elements within current USAID. And then development, which I said I would meditate on, which is, what does it mean? And I think people really mean one of the two. They either mean health and humanitarian assistance, or they mean strategies and help to improve economic growth. And they're very different things. Americans donate tens of billions of dollars to private groups every year to go overseas, faith-based groups and others. Then they're just as vital as government programs. But for economic growth, we think the Millennium Challenge Corporation model, which we championed in the last Republican administration, is the better model. And we would want to see it expanded. And it would be independent. But that means, I think mainly, it means know your money. It means the whole new paradigm that MCC means and the MCC effect that we hope. The whole new division that would be created to get countries to threshold, and then graduate them, as Ambassador Green has talked about, and then be able to attract the $800+ billion that's floating around the world all the time, looking for a return on investment. Because that's where the growth is going to come from. It's not going to be from development assistance. The taxpayers are tapped out. $2.5 trillion since World War II, just in the United States. So, and I know it's a small percentage of the budget, but nevertheless, we need new ways of doing business. We want all these other agencies that were created in the 30s, which is EXIM, and in the 70s by Nixon, which was OPIC, and USTDA and others, the Africa Development, the Inter-American Development, all to go to MCC. OPIC can unwind all of its current loans. Perhaps there would be some room for development finance in the very few countries where market failure prevents a capital market from existing. But in general, we want to rein in the military development assistance efforts and get them back at state. There are a lot of other things I could talk about, but those are some of the highlights. Certainly, we want a major restructuring of state to go along with this, and the elimination of J, and certainly renaming Undersecretary of Arms Control and International Security. Those are some of the highlights. And please, Congress, stop earmarking.
I think there'll be, yeah, you've hit on an area of consensus, I think. That's really helpful, and thank you for the correction. I was thinking you're of this new, or the MCC plus.
Well, we called it an agency kind of to ease the pain.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm glad I hadn't totally misread that, but good. And that I think segues nicely to what EMFAN. It is a different vision, but you also do talk about two pillars, and you started to describe those, but I was wondering, George, if you could say more about again, as you thought about the design, the pros and cons, like how is it that this organization really gets us to that next level of effectiveness and impact?
Well, we went the direction of creating a new development agency because as we talked about what would be brought together, we realized that we were creating an organization that was bigger and more powerful and extensive than existing AID. And we didn't want to create the perception that we were folding OPIC, in MCC and PEPFAR into the current AID. We wanted to create a dynamic where we were bringing the best practices of all organizations together. And you were going to identify, you were going to work on those best practices, and that's what would drive this new organization. And because you had brought together the main instruments of U.S. assistance, you would have a more prominent, powerful agency that deserved to have a director that had cabinet status. We went the direction of focusing also on development finance because we see traditional foreign assistance, grant assistance, as a very different mechanism than market-driven private sector support. And the future out there is likely to be grant assistance at current or modest increases in level, whereas the potential for development finance is dramatic. And the U.S. is today not competitive with its European and Asian competitors. OPIC does not have the authority, does not have the resources, does not have the breadth. And there were some people who wanted to bring all of it together. And there's a good rationale for that you want a nice segue from grant assistance into market-driven assistance. We came to the conclusion that the functions are sufficiently separate and that the private sector is a lot more comfortable working with what looks like an OPIC on steroids than what looks like a more traditional government bureaucracy.
Got it, thank you. And maybe one follow-up question for Jim, because you mentioned an agency on steroids, and I used to work at MCC and think the model is very effective as it is, and there are some out there who are concerned that you could love MCC to death. You give it new resources, tools, and ambition, but it does have a model that's set up through legislation to be pretty specific and hit a specific range of countries. So how do you think about some of those potential challenges to putting MCC on steroids?
And that is kind of what the alternative to what George is talking about is what we're talking about. And I think if it's done carefully, I'm aware that there are risks to that and any agency that grows. And so there had to be a transition period where the development chunk of AID is part on paper is part of MCC, but there would be a transition where it would be carefully thought out, the transition and also the countries that are going to be gone. I mean, India, Turkey, and places like that don't need any more assistance. Brazil, and And so, and I think Ambassador Green has talked about that he's already planning on graduations and on reducing the number of missions. And so that would be part and parcel of it, but it would not be done willy-nilly.
No, a quick follow-up, and that is the EMFAN group was very supportive of both the PEPFAR and the MCC model. But if you moved AID's Development Assistance Program over to MCC, you would dramatically change the nature of the MCC.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's some of the challenges that you talked about would have to be managed very carefully as the model would potentially change.
We're all about change at Heritage United, so it's,
Excellent.
Hope and change?
So I wanted to move on to some of the thematics that were highlighted throughout the reports, in the sense that we know that the U.S. capacities have to evolve in order to meet them. And so one of the main ones that's already been referenced is around humanitarian crises and fragile states. So we know that an increasing number of the extreme poor will be concentrated in fragile states, and that there are real challenges and, to be honest, a lack of proven models on how to transition those countries and also to make sure that reconstruction, stabilization, recovery are conducted effectively. So, and again, it's too bad that Karen's not here because that report really did focus more on coordination with state and DoD. But Jeremy, I wanted to turn it over to you because of your experience at OFTA, and then also highlight some of the proposals that seek to address these challenges around fragile states.
Yeah, and this is a really important, I think, corollary to what George and Jim have been talking about in the whole development finance space. So you've got a set of countries now that are not going to be reliant on aid, and frankly, the money, the development financing that they can tap through private sector and markets is much, much greater than anything that exists in the foreign aid space, and we don't do a good job of leveraging that. The flip side to that is you have a set of countries in the world, and they're the countries where most global crises and the great global challenges the U.S. will face over the next 50 years will originate, that don't have the same access to that kind of development financing. They're much higher risk. And they're areas where U.S. development assistance has not traditionally focused a great deal outside of health and humanitarian engagement. And they're areas where that development assistance, if it is focused there, potentially can do more relative good because of the lack of access to other forms of development finance. But they're much higher risk. They're very challenging. And as a country, we have not really developed the systems that we need in order to engage effectively in those sorts of countries. And so, the striking difference between how the U.S. engages in the immediate aftermath of a crisis on the humanitarian side versus the longer-term recovery and transition period was, I think it's amazing. And when you look at why is the humanitarian response so effective, it's because it has access to a lot of tools and flexibilities that suddenly evaporate once we consider the humanitarian phase to be over. So no-year money, competition waivers, dedicated staffing and surge staffing mechanisms, no earmarking on humanitarian funds. When the humanitarian, and I saw this over and over during my time at OFTA, when we would hand off after a natural disaster to our development mission colleagues, we went from being a sprinter to someone in a straitjacket as an agency. And our mission colleagues didn't have nearly the degree of flexibility and agility that we had, not because they were any less capable or competent or anything like that, simply because they had a dramatically different and weaker toolkit available to them. And so what we propose in our paper is a number of, and not an exhaustive list by any means, but a number of concrete, tangible steps that could be taken relatively easily, not to say they're easy things to do, to begin rectifying that. So begin making much more aggressive use of competition waiver authority within USAID in certain environments, certain transitional and insecure environments, much as OFTA does. That enables the programming to be much more quick, responsive, and agile than the traditional 1 to 2 year timelines that it takes to otherwise program USAID money. Set up a dedicated surge staffing mechanism for development surge or post-crisis surge, whatever you want to call it, much as OFTA has for crisis contexts, and begin building and cultivating staff capabilities around that. And then critically, free up some money. So it's very, very difficult for missions to do effective post-crisis response because they often receive almost no money to do so. And so in the Philippines, for example, after Typhoon Haiyan, the White House pushed the aid mission really, really hard to put out a big, bold vision for the post-crisis reconstruction, post-disaster reconstruction. And so the mission did and came up with ideas for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects and got about, I think, 6 million. And so, you know, that's not nothing, but it's a pittance. And so if we want to be a player in that, and I think we should be a player as a country in that, we need to find other ways of financing that. Now, there's not necessarily going to be new money. There won't generally be new money, but there's often pipeline money or other money that if there were earmark flexibility, missions could reprogram to focus on and to reprioritize some of their existing resources rather than have to stay on the same development programming track that they were on pre-crisis. That no longer is as relevant as it was.
Great, thank you. And I want to turn it over to some others and also because some of the other proposals talked about moving assistance from state to aid, but retaining the policy function at state. So I would love to hear your thoughts, but then also around, I mean, the counter to that would be, well, if you lose some of the programming at state, it loses the diplomatic heft as well. So I don't know if, Errol, you want to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I'll comment primarily on the first part because that's what we actually spent a lot of time thinking about this on the task force and what that might look like. And it was one of the areas where we did delve a little bit deeper into structure. Box moving exercises are not always the most animated conversations, but this one was, and I think as it relates to humanitarian assistance, it was definitely part of our discussion. I first want to say I agree with Jim that any of the changes that we propose and that others propose, it's not like somebody just flips a switch and it happens. It needs to be deliberate over a series of time. So keep that in mind when I tell you that we had talked about basically in the context of creating more efficiency and effectiveness and sort of streamlining some of the ways that the U.S. does foreign assistance, we had talked about moving, sort of solving some of the issues that arose after Iraq and Afghanistan, where there was a little bit of mission creep on behalf of state into programming that USAID does. There was a little bit of mission creep by USAID into the policy sphere, which had previously been State Department. And so sort of addressing some of those issues was the underlying reason why we eventually proposed to create a new Bureau for Conflict and Fragility within USAID. And that would combine the programming functions of the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, CSO, the OTI, Office of Transition Initiatives, and CMM. The State Department would, of course, retain policy functions in these areas. Additionally, we had advocated for a new Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance that would combine OFTA, BPRM, and the Food for Peace program. Again, graduated over a period of time. We're doing a huge research study on forced migration, as I know Cindy is too. And so I think the last person that would want and the last group that would want to advocate for a decrease in support to refugees is me and CSIS, and so this would need to be done over a graduated, very well thought out period of time.
Great, yeah, George.
Just a quick comment, and that is the specific suggestions are very good. What's missing is the overarching instrument. And fragility, dealing with fragility is a development, political, social, security issue. And it requires engagement of all three Ds. And what none of us propose or suggest is how you bring that collaboration among the three Ds. You've got it now on the ground in the form, if you have the right ambassador. But that ambassador and that embassy team doesn't have the right support structure back in Washington.
Jim or Nilmani, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Of course, I wouldn't call it 3 Ds, 2 Ds and an H, since it would be humanitarian, and which AID does well. I mean, we want to save that, but we just want to make it less complicated and less bureaucratic and more streamlined and less expensive. And the other thing is, shockingly, we're concerned about American self-interest and about using the ESF, making it explicitly political assistance and buying friendship. I mean, that's what happens. That's what the real world is like. If you look at that AID spending chart online of where the U.S. has been spending money, it's foreign aid money. It tracks completely with where the U.S. has been at war. I mean, since 1946. So let's be honest. Let's encourage people who we give money to vote with us at the UN. And let's encourage countries in Western Europe to spend 2% of their GDP on the military, and not boast about 0.07 on aid, but just the U.S. government, the U.S. military has been a great development tool. I mean, we have open seas, open skies for commerce and for all the things people want in this world, thanks to the U.S. military. And so which is not to endorse the Pentagon grabbing turf and doing development assistance projects like SERP and things. I mean, that should be scaled back. But those are some of the things that we think about.
Well, I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to come back in on these topics? Because I know that and Nilmani also, because I know you've commented a little bit about PRM and the diplomatic angle, but then also this question of, spending money that's in U.S. self-interest, but doing it in a way that potentially, achieves objectives more readily.
Yeah, and look, I think the U.S. has a range of interests. There's not a single U.S. interest, and certainly my own experience, both as a development practitioner in the field, and I think there's been research that bears this out, is that countries take a pretty sophisticated, nuanced view of the leverage that our assistance gives us or doesn't give us. And so if it looks like a bald attempt to buy influence, it ironically may buy less influence. If it looks like something that is aligned with their own understanding of their own development priorities, assuming those are benign, and they aren't always necessarily, then that will, interestingly, buy us more influence, potentially. So I think it's, I both agree and disagree with Jim. I mean, I think we do need our foreign assistance to pursue U.S. interests, but I think we need to be smart about understanding how that dynamic plays with the partner countries that we're engaging with, and and be real, be pretty sophisticated about the dynamics of how we attain that influence. And I think we also need to be forthright that we're doing this for interest reasons, but also for value reasons. And that's not just in the humanitarian and health space; it's also in the development space. And if countries see that we are aligned, we're not just kind of throwing interests around, but also trying to align around values. I think that too also gives us more leverage and influence.
Great, and Nilmani.
And just quickly comment that a lot of the things that were mentioned around fragile states, they're very specific to fragile states, and they're completely different than what you'd see in countries that are lower income but have stable governance structures. And just like my minivan's awesome to get my kids to school, but it would be a terrible lawnmower. Like that, I think that's like MCC, right? Like MCC is an awesome minivan, but it would just make a terrible lawnmower. And I just don't think that you can say, like, because MCC does a fabulous job doing what it's doing, means that it should be doing work in places like fragile states.
Great, well, and before we were gonna transition to some other topics, but does anyone else want to weigh in on the private sector, MCC, any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, the fragile states they're not ready for development of any kind. Development assistance as properly known. I mean, it's saving them from starvation or from other disasters. So it's a little unfair, I think, to make that comparison. I'm scrambling for a metaphor to offset the minivan.
He doesn't drive a minivan.
Actually,
Well, I used to.
Jim forces me to jump in here.
Okay.
Because if you look at the list of the 50 fragile states that the World Bank and the Fund for Peace puts out, AID has done 1/4 of their public-private partnerships in countries that are on that list. OPIC has done a bunch of business in those countries. MCC is in 11 of those countries, either with a full-blown program or a threshold program.
Yeah.
And they're fragile countries like South Sudan, where probably none of that's going on.
Yeah.
But there are other countries that are almost fragile and whatnot, where there's some degree of private sector activity, and that can't be the driver of U.S. support for those countries, but it can play an element, as those various programs show.
Yeah, and thanks for highlighting that. When I was at MCC, that was one thing we looked at, compacts with countries like Niger, Nepal, so there are those that are fragile. So I think part of the question is, we do have this toolkit, and I do think what I see all of us struggling with is it's a toolkit, it applies differentially, it's a spectrum, it's not clear buckets, and how do we develop the systems and protocols to deploy the tools effectively? And that's certainly, there's no easy answer to that. Jeremy, one quick
So
last
I mean, and again, I think I partly agree, partly disagree with Jim. I think I wouldn't say you can't achieve development outcomes in some of these basket case states. I think you can, but I think it's a very different way of doing that than what you do at a macro level through MCC engagement or in states that are stable and better governed. But if you look at, for example, the history of development support to Liberia, Liberia coming out of the war was in very rough shape, very weak governance, and it remains weak, but it is in dramatically better shape than it was a decade ago. And smart, focused development assistance has played an important role in that.
And it may just be a question of semantics and bureaucratic, politics, but yeah, okay, so it stops being a basket and turns into maybe an old broken down minivan. And so, okay, and then you take that,
Right.
the countries that would be sub-threshold that we propose creating a new unit at MCC for
Right,
and
that's right.
solve the
Yep.
problem.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Before we get to the big topic of country graduation, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about, we haven't focused on health yet, which is 24% of the foreign assistance portfolio, and there are a number of proposals. So I was wondering if you could all jump in. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk, and there have been previous efforts to evaluate whether PEPFAR would be better at state or USAID, and I think that's an important question, but then also about the organization itself so that we can achieve better outcomes wherever the coordinator happens to sit. So I think if you could comment both on the structural piece, but then also on the effectiveness issue, that would be great. Does anyone want to jump in?
Well, as I've said, we think PEPFAR is great. We think it's working fine. It should be at state along with AID under F, the Undersecretary and former AID administrator who would coordinate all assistance, all 25 programs, and be statutorily on the board of MCC, among other things. And so don't break what's working,
Right.
but eliminate the duplication and redundancy currently at AID.
Okay, Errol and then Jeremy.
Actually, I'm glad that you mentioned the if it's not broken, don't fix it thing, because we heard that a lot from people, and we felt like that was it was an insufficient answer to a fundamental question of where should it be, given the outcomes. PEPFAR is an amazing program; they've done amazing work. The President's Emergency Fund is also in its 13th year of existence, so maybe we need to transition it over to a more development arm so that those development the Global Health Bureau, specifically at USAID, can learn from the lessons of PEPFAR. Again, over a period of years, we don't want to cut off ARVs to anybody. This is not what anybody is advocating for. However, we felt like when we looked at the whole picture and we looked at all these boxes, it made a lot more sense for, given where the HIV/AIDS crisis is today, and it's more management, it's less sort of seeking this cure. It's more, how do we sustain people and how do we provide support to primarily young women and girls who are disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS. Well, maybe PEPFAR is not the best mechanism as it currently exists to address some of those underlying sort of women, youth, girls issues that are the modern face or the current face of HIV and AIDS. So I'll leave it.
Yeah, Jeremy.
I mean, I think PEPFAR is a robust enough program that it could be highly effective whether you house it at aid or you house it at state. Obviously, it's very effective currently housed at state with the overall coordination sitting there. The preponderance of the work is done by AID, which suggests that AID could do it very effectively, could house it very effectively as well. So we didn't focus on that aspect in our paper. What we did focus on is this weird division of labor between AID and CDC that's emerged over the years within PEPFAR. And it stands in really stark contrast to other areas, particularly the Ebola, the way we set up division of labor between AID and CDC on Ebola. So within, and Cindy and I will be publishing a blog post on this as soon as one of us can write it. We looked at the CDC planning numbers over the last 5 years to look at how the PEPFAR planning numbers, to look at how AID and CDC divide labor within that program. And what comes across is a pretty haphazard division of labor. In one country, you'll have CDC leading on a technical area that next door AID leads on. In the third country, next door to those two, they split it 50-50 by geography. That is not a functionally driven way to set up a multi-billion-dollar aid program. So what and it stands in contrast to how we did it on Ebola, where AID and CDC, under the leadership of the NSC, sat down and hammered out AID will lead on these functions and CDC will lead on these functions, and then we budgeted under that basis. And so what we propose in our paper is moving towards that kind of an arrangement, reviewing the way it is set up now, designating which agency has comparative advantage in which functions, and then beginning to rationalize based on that. Because it does excellent work right now, but it also, in effect, you have to maintain pretty parallel capabilities in two federal agencies that are doing much of the same work. And that's not an ideal way to do, but it's an understandable way to do business when you're setting up an emergency program and you're scrambling to go. And as Errol says, the 13th year of a massive federal aid program, I think we could probably find better ways to rationalize that.
Great. George.
Yeah, just I don't have to repeat what's been said because that was a lot of our thinking. In addition, coordination is always the second best solution. The best solution is clear lines of authority. And as we were grappling with the PEPFAR issue and whether or not to move it in with the rest of the agencies, the issue that came up several times was, well, who's going to resolve the differences between AID and CDC? They have different cultures, they can't get along. Well, when I was at AID and in charge of the former Soviet Union, we did a lot of work with CDC, and there was a very constructive relationship. And no disrespect for the current coordinator, who I have the highest respect for, get the coordinating functions out of the way. And let AID and CDC work together. They both have specific expertise, and I think you'd have a more efficient, effective system that way.
And AID and CDC can get along when roles and responsibility are clear, as we've seen under PMI, as we've seen under Ebola. It's when those are muddled that you get some friction.
Yeah. U.S. doctors are expensive, though, right? I think that's something I've heard.
Some people see it through their own pocketbook, too. Okay, great. So now many of you and a few people have mentioned that a big focus of Administrator Mark Green's is on country graduation, transition, and we've talked about, with the emerging economies and greater development, the relationship between the U.S. government and our assistance programs and these countries should begin to change. So a few of the reports touch on this. And maybe I'll start with you, George, on how you approach the issue of country graduation.
Well, it's an issue that EMFAN has been looking at for a few years. And we've sort of come at it from the point of view of country ownership. And that's led us to be very engaged with the issue of DRM, domestic resource mobilization. And we're now looking at it from the point of view, so what is a transition process? And what is the relationship we want to have going past an aid relationship? And I think the important thing about considering, and we think there needs to be a strategy, a transition strategy with benchmarks, but it needs to be focused, unlike what some of the legislation, congressional legislation sounds like. It sounds like you want a transition program for every country in the world. Well, you don't. There are half the aid countries that aren't ready for a transition. You need to make sure that you're focusing this on those countries which in the next 5 or 15 years may be able to move beyond grant assistance. And what we've done in the past is we've sort of done that willy-nilly. And in Eastern Europe, after 10, 12 years, we cut off the Northern Eastern European countries, and then 2 years later said, oh, geez, we got to go back in. And we had no mechanism for going in. There was no sustainability there. So there needs to be a much more thoughtful process. There need to be instruments in place. Are there ways to continue to support university exchanges, partnerships? Are there endowments or foundations? Maybe the current regional foundations that we have, Inter-American Foundation, Africa Foundation, Eurasia Foundation, Asia, maybe they're a mechanism for continuing a relationship in those countries. And it needs to be focused to begin with at the strategic level with real benchmarks.
Great. Nilmani, Errol,
I'll kick it off and then
Okay,
I'll turn it over
great.
to Nomini for color commentary. We thought about this a lot, and we figured that whoever was coming in as the Trump administration's administrator of USAID would be pushed on this, and I think our gut instinct was, as a lot of people on the stages, I think, was right on that. So we basically said broadly that we would, the USAID should look to generate budget savings by ending programs or missions that are no longer central to a U.S. foreign assistance strategy. Separately, we had called for the U.S. foreign assistance strategy, so those things, it's no coincidence. This is actually based on a presidential policy directive from 2010 that suggested that the U.S. should disperse assistance less broadly and instead increase the focus of resources, policy tools, and engagement to countries and subregions where the conditions are right to sustain progress. And so within that framework that I think is still very, very relevant today, we thought that as part of the strategy, there should be a middle-income country graduation strategy. Jim mentioned Turkey and India and some other places where I think, especially if that country has their own foreign assistance program, maybe we should be looking at, sort of reevaluating what our relationship looks like, building on some of what George just mentioned. We also really delved into domestic resource mobilization, or in English, taxes. A little plug for an event that we're having at CSIS on Friday on domestic resource mobilization, 10:30 a.m. on Friday. So that's really critical, and Jeremy and I were talking before this about how, actually I think it was Patrick and I were talking about how that's a way that countries can increase their own sovereignty, really. Consider limiting or ending small foreign assistance programs, seek division of labor with other donors and MDBs, and finally, reducing sectors of focus as called for in that 2010 presidential directive.
Great. Okay, Nilmani, I want your thoughts, especially given that some of these programs do exist because specific members of Congress might want them. So how your broader commentary, but also how you see transition playing from that angle.
So part of the reason we were suggesting cutting some programming was maybe they don't make sense anymore. It saves the U.S. taxpayer money, and it may not be right for the country. So if there was a member of Congress that was particularly attached to a program, I think first you look at the legislation. Does it actually require that to be done? Yep. Secondly, you engage with that member and the other people who are part of the caucus that care about it, because it didn't get passed because one person pushed it. It's hard to get stuff passed, so it means a lot of people cared about it at some point in history. Maybe they've moved on, or maybe they don't know things have changed on the ground, and it's not. So it's really up to us in the development community or in the administration to brief Congress and explain why these things should be changed and it should be more move forward, and then to help think of what language needs to replace that to adjust the money. And I wanted to hit on one of the kind of the reasons behind we were suggesting shifting down some of our assistance is because in our paper we talk about how the majority of money going from the U.S. to developing countries is through the private sector. It's not through government aid. So more than 90% of money from the U.S. to the developing countries is from the private sector. So we were really thinking about, those funds tend to go to the countries that are doing better. So maybe we should be working to help direct those to things that are productive, or working on how policy to benefit that, rather than still continuing to use U.S. government money when there are dollars there that are interested in going to these regions.
Great. Yeah. Jim, you also talk about
Well, I would be, speaking of plugs, I would be remiss not to plug our annual Index of Economic Freedom, which we started in the mid-90s specifically for an alternative to economic development policies rather than government assistance. And in terms of graduation, we want to make countries think graduation all the time, kind of like your kid graduates from kindergarten and then from like third grade. And so graduation, and that's why we want to see this new division at MCC. We want countries to be thinking to to get to that point where the threshold, then to get finally to a compact, and then 2 compacts, that's it, you know? That really should be it. I think the work should be done by then.
There's optimism in that, which I like. Jeremy.
So we didn't very specifically address graduation in our paper. It's sort of implied in the fragility towards inclusive growth trajectory that we talk about. But I'm really struck by, despite some of the different structural ideas, the conceptual convergence across the stage here, and in this idea that we do need different, somewhat distinct toolkits for different types of countries, and a spectrum that we can move them along. And that spectrum involves decreasing reliance on aid the further they move along the spectrum, and recognition that the bulk of financing for international development is not going to come from aid grants. It's going to come from the private sector, domestic resource mobilization, and other sources. And we don't have a toolkit in the US right now that's very effective at leveraging and engaging with.
That's great. And then I think also recognizing there's a spectrum, but the trajectory is certainly not linear. And so, right, and how do you have that right mix
Absolutely.
to keep achieving progress? So great. Well, thanks so much to the panelists for these thoughtful comments. And I want to now open it up to the floor, and I'll take 3 questions at a time. Over here.
Thank you very much, Simon Henshaw from State PRM. Just a terrific panel. Really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you very much. Love the reports. I forgive me for being parochial, but I am from PRM, so just a comment there. I find in some of these reports, both yours and others I've read, there's a skipping over of humanitarian diplomacy in the multilateral world. It's treated as if it's another type of bilateral assistance, and it's not. The United States is a leader in the humanitarian world set up after World War II because of our linking of diplomacy and assistance to that world. We're the biggest supporters of the major multilateral institutions like ICRC. And we work very closely with them, and we've managed to link that diplomacy and assistance to have an incredible amount of influence, not just with them, but with countries that host refugees, with other donor nations. So I would ask that we remember that linkage as we look through this, and remember it when we tie it to the other work that we're doing on the bilateral front. Thank you.
Great. Good question. Yeah, here in the middle.
Hi, Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. So, recognizing the desire to have more flexibility, less congressional earmarks, what does the advent of the Trump administration and the scare that it gave everybody that it was going to slash and burn funding, leading Congress to take a stronger hand this time, how much does that perhaps rightfully raise questions about Congress being involved and not letting administrations do whatever they want?
Okay, great. And then Nora up there.
Hi, Nora O'Connell, Save the Children. Thank you so much for this fascinating panel. And one of the questions that I wanted to bring up in sort of how the world has changed is I think we've talked a lot about the changing nature of financing, the changing nature of humanitarian crisis, but I actually haven't heard folks talk about the changing nature of poverty and in particular intra-country inequality. So I mean, UP India has 200 million people and would be one of the poorest countries of the world. And so as we think about, are we taking a statist approach to development and saying, well, if the state is stable, development is accomplished, or how does inequality factor into it, and how do these things help us tackle these challenges? Thanks.
Great. 3 great questions, and I would just flag in terms of what Simon said, you talked about humanitarian diplomacy, but it's true even more broadly in terms of multilateral engagement around both different kinds of assistance. So I'm going to give a chance to each of the panelists to answer, to pick and choose, not to answer all of them. So let me start with Errol.
I want to answer the first one, actually, because this is something that we thought about, and it's included in recommendation 2.2. We talk about seeking division of labor with other donors and MDBs. A little bit of that is seeking language that seems to work in today's Washington, and a lot of that is, this is what we should be doing. The U.S. should be doubling down in our leadership of the 4 regional MDBs. it's a force multiplier for us. It's also the right thing to do if we want to be a hedge against China and other rising sort of development players, I should say. Then we need to maintain our leadership in that from a geostrategic point of view. It's just the right thing to do to maintain U.S. global leadership in addition. So I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Let me add to that.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
And thanks for addressing that question, and you're right on. We grappled with not only the issue of how you get greater coherence between our bilateral humanitarian work and our multilateral, including the banks and the IOs, but also how you get better coherence between bilateral assistance and multilateral assistance. And we considered, do you move the responsibility for the MDBs into this new agency? And one of the issues that we left hanging, including with moving PEPFAR in, is what do you do about the diplomatic aspect of health in PEPFAR? Because there's a very important diplomatic aspect to that, to humanitarian assistance. And that's one of those unsolved issues out there that we would love to see people help grapple with.
Okay, great. Yeah, Jim, Jeremy, and then Nilma.
Yeah, well, I think we can thank the administration for provoking this discussion today. This has been productive and in-depth. And I don't think, and this was mentioned at the Atlanta Council rollout of their thing last week, was that we probably wouldn't have had this big discussion and this big period of analysis and introspection if there hadn't been a really dramatic proposal on the table. And the reality is that the 150 account has doubled between FY 2006 and 2016. So even a 30% cut, as draconian as that sounds, would not take it back to where it was 10 years ago. So, and everybody knows that there are a lot of places where we could streamline and use money, the taxpayer money, better. So.
Great. Jeremy.
Three great questions. Simon, on yours, so we took a different position than the CSIS report did on the question of PRM and AID's respective roles, and we did not recommend folding PRM into this new humanitarian bureau that we recommend AID should create. A big part of we didn't elaborate all the reasons for that in the report, but motivating that was this recognition that it's quite important to have a strong humanitarian voice both at AID and at state. And if you strip PRM out of the State Department, you lose that. And for all the reasons that you've mentioned, our influence with the multilateral system, the importance of humanitarian diplomacy as a counterpart to humanitarian assistance, it's important to have that strong voice in both institutions. And so would agree with you there. What we did propose is a more rigorous and systematic approach to how the U.S. applies its multilateral toolkit and uses its multilateral resources. Because it is quite inconsistent, and different parts of the government use it in different and inconsistent ways. And so we proposed a multilateral aid review modeled somewhat on what the UK has done that would guide US policy and funding towards multilateral institutions. On the CQ question, since no one's taken that yet, I would say two things. I think to a large degree, Congress has always led on this. I can't remember a time when an administration budget for foreign aid didn't hit the hill with a clunk, and they're generally Congress will do what it wants to do on foreign assistance budgeting, regardless of the administration. I think you're seeing a more extreme version of that right now, but it's a more extreme version of an existing dynamic. Does Congress have more influence, or should Congress have more influence? I think in some ways, yes. One thing that would be really helpful is if Congress would start doing more regular authorizing legislation on this. And if Congress wants to have more influence on foreign policy, or is skeptical of this administration or any administration's posture on foreign policy, well, they could assert a greater role by beginning to authorize again. The NDAA gets authorized every 2 years. The Farm Bill gets authorized every 5. And AID hasn't had a new authorization since forever. State had one a couple years ago, but it was the first time in a very long time. And so if Congress wants that role, it's there sitting, waiting for them if they want to legislate.
Great. Nilmani.
Okay, well, I'm going to take the Congress question. And I would push back a little and say Congress has authorized a lot of things, and those are a lot of things that people up here mentioned that were working. So Congress authorized PEPFAR, and then it reauthorized it, and it reauthorized it again. Congress authorized MCC. Congress authorized Power Africa through the Electrify Africa Act, led by Chairman Royce. There are a lot of really successful things in assistance that have been championed and authorized by Congress. And maybe part of the reason they have been successful is that they did have this public vetting that went through through Congress. So sometimes I feel like when we talk about congressional earmarks or directions, we view it as a bad thing. But it actually has been very good and successful in many areas. On the things that could be improved, you know, there's a lot of room for moving those things through Congress. I remember as a congressional staffer, there's this one agency of the U.S. government. Some of you worked there. I can see you. I asked them repeatedly, tell me what reports you don't want to write anymore. Give me a list. I know you're wasting a lot of time writing it because I used to be the person writing them. And tell us and let me know who championed that report maybe 15 years ago, and we'll try to eliminate that. And it was a lot of back and forth with this agency, and ultimately I never got a good list, right, of things that they can do. And with technology, a lot of the reports that are required, like, they really don't need to be written anymore. Like, that stuff's on the web, it's searchable. Like, staff don't need to be spending time doing that. Similarly, on if there are earmarks that aren't useful, you know, having maybe an outside group or, you know, or someone in the administration really delineating why that particular earmark is not useful, and then communicating it so that it can get through. It is both the House and the Senate have tried very hard to get an overarching foreign aid authorization bill through different generations. I know Diana spent a lot of time working on that. And even though we didn't have an overarching bill, there are chunks that can be bitten off and moved forward to reform to get things moving in the way that they should.
Great.
No one addressed Nora's question.
Yeah,
so
I
don't
can
know.
also
Oh,
address
okay.
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll have two very rapid answers, and then I want to take a few more questions from the audience.
The
So I think-
important thing on what Nomini said, on those 8 foreign aid legislation that the last Congress passed and the one last week, the READ Act, they all avoid micromanagement, avoid earmarks, require accountability evaluations, require strategies. It's very constructive legislation.
Great. Yeah, Jeremy and Errol.
So Nora, I think that's a super important point, and we made a very specific decision in our paper in saying that the priority is not growth per se, it's inclusive growth in terms of those countries that are stable and well governed. You know, the value add of U.S. developmental engagement in those countries is not just bumping up their GDP, it's also investing and supporting that growth in a way that enables it to lift up some of the poorest citizens and alleviate extreme poverty, not just kind of average poverty.
Real quickly, I agree with all that. I want to reflect some of the discussions that were happening of the task force that didn't make it into the report. I'll leave my own editorialization out of this. But there was discussion of if there is you mentioned UP, right? UP. If India has a space program and India has a foreign aid program, then maybe there's some sort of leverage that the U.S. can give diplomatically, politically, to encourage them to spend less money on moonshots and more money on Uttar Pradesh. I'm saying that mainly because the saves of the world are going to have to respond to that, because that's something that is being discussed right now.
Great. Okay, let's take a couple more questions, especially from this side of the room. Yeah. Oh, please wait for a microphone.
I'm Patrick Fine from FHI 360. So there seems to be a consensus on the panel that it's in America's interest to address human development challenges, and that those challenges are highly situational. I've heard that from most of you. And that we need a toolkit, different tools to address different challenges in different situations. But then when we take it to the organizational piece, the structural piece, what I haven't heard anybody talk about is organizational culture. Because if we think about the agencies that we have or the pieces we have, they have very specific cultures. The state culture is different from the USAID culture. The USAID culture is different from the MCC culture. That's different from OPIC's culture, and that's, I think, heavily influenced or conditioned or shaped by the missions, the history, and then who they, the kind of day-to-day work that they're involved in. So what I want to see is that we have the best tools to address the situations we're trying to solve, with problems we're trying to solve. And I think it would be important to think about what organizational culture, when thinking about how to organize and where to put different functions, what organizational cultures are going to enable those tools. And I'd be interested in folks' reaction to that.
Great. Everyone think of your 10-second version on that. Okay, I think we had a question back there.
Howdy, greetings. I'm Thomas Ward. I'm an economist.
No, speak up.
Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Okay.
that's good.
I want to go back to the graduation part because I think that's the most critical part we're looking at. And I want to look at it from a couple perspectives. One, I think it's important we look at, last year was the 50-year anniversary of welfare state here in the U.S. What can we learn from that we can apply to the international development space, I think is critical. If you look at, we need to look at new means, such as the P3 front, because that is a reality of where the money is in the private sector, and to leverage it if you want sustainability versus continued projects that start and end. And then one more step what goes into that, my background comes from working at the World Bank for 10 years. You have the annual meetings coming up here in October. And in the graduation of that, you want to really look at, I watched when the ECA countries graduated. There was no fanfare then what they graduated. It was all about how much money his budget is going to be lost and how the organization is going to shrink, because it's about the bureaucracy. So we got to think about, is a lot of this talk about the bureaucracy shrinking and withholding their purpose versus the project and the results on the ground and the mission. And with that, you want to think about HIPIC. Is HIPIC in that aspect creating a moral hazard? And is it selling it as investments versus expenditures?
Great, thank you.
Which I think is important.
Yeah, thank you so much. A last question right up here. Oh.
Thank you. I'm Renata Harlan from the European Union delegation here in Washington. Last year, the EU has been one of the two peer reviewers of US aid system in the OECD Development Assistance Committee together with Korea. 3 findings that I still have in my mind. The one is the number of implementing agencies as a constraint for US aid efficiency, so it's good that you discuss it. The second was, surprisingly, the lack of an overall development policy strategy. We have heard a bit of it already here, but I'm still surprised that while some of the congressional initiatives for me are still like kind of balloons filled with paint thrown at the wall, but it doesn't make a comprehensive together. So we are hitting here, something which is called realpolitik probably, but it was that was another element. The third, and this is also a comment, was the inefficiency of the American food aid system, which is still a lot based on America first. So it's in-kind provision where local markets, where aid is needed, would function. 2 more comments in terms of graduation to enrich the debate. The EU has gone through this. We have stopped bilateral cooperation with a couple of countries based on a system. One of which was whatever is a G20 country, we need to go into other partnerships. We have kept them all eligible to use regional funds. We do a lot of regional integration with our funds. Yeah. Our funds have been all grant funds. So when you discuss graduations, do you think, for instance, from moving from grant funding to loan funding? Also, we are just discussing this week, our ministers, the 28 ministers of the EU member states, together with the EU institutions, about exactly that graduation in another perspective. How do we want to cooperate with the middle-income countries that we have graduated in the future when it comes to the implementation of climate goals and the Sustainable Development Goals in the Agenda 2030? Great. And the other one, what I also find interesting is development humanitarian nexus. Yeah. What do we do with that? Yeah. It's also something where I have heard some elements, but I think the debate needs to go further, and we are definitely also happy to take this up. Yep. I'm stopping here.
Okay, great. So we have 2 minutes left, which means everyone gets about 30 seconds. These were really a rich set of questions, so you're going to have to wrap up any targeted answers and your concluding statement in 30 seconds. Okay, go, Errol.
I can model brief. I'll just take Patrick's, the different organizational cultures, and I would take it a step further. Skill sets and career tracks are precisely why we were opposed to a full merger of USAID and state. We didn't see a productive career track as one that starts in Ebola response and then goes to sort of stamping visas, and there's different sort of skill sets involved.
Great. To address the paint balloon on the wall issue, Senators Young and Senator Shaheen, in a bipartisan manner, introduced a bill that required the administration to create a development strategy, and that was really the first step. It's the National Diplomacy and Development Strategy, and what we just saw happen in the Senate in the subcommittee on appropriations is they included reference to that bill. So it would call on the administration to actually create that strategy as required in the Jean Shaheen and Todd Young bill.
Thank you. Jeremy.
Agree on organizational culture. I think we do need distinct. I think diplomacy and development require distinct cultures and distinct subcultures within them, and that should shape how we approach the institutional organization question. What can we learn from the U.S. welfare state experience? That sounds like a really thorny and fraught and controversial session itself. But one thing I think is important that I don't think any of the papers addressed is the growing importance of building national safety net structures for national development. Ethiopia and the PSNP program there is a good example of one way of doing that. And on food aid, yes, I know our paper recommended finishing off, completing the food aid reforms that were initiated under the Bush administration, carried forward through in the Obama administration, and hopefully will continue to be taken forward under this president.
Well, as to the balkanized foreign affairs agencies of the U.S. government and their cultures, first of all, I think we should remember that a lot of the problems we're dealing with in other countries and the obstacles to development is because of cultural problems, long-seated, and things that may never be overcome in our lifetime. So I'd want to see a new incentive. I don't want to incentivize a new culture in a merged state AID and in OPIC going to MCC. And we're not have to be bound to the past of these cultures. I think PL 480 is terrible. We say so in our paper on food aid. We want to see it go away. We don't want U.S. bottoms to be used. I worked at the U.S. mission to the OECD. I know the DAC, and I'm glad to hear that. Ambassador Green talked about G20 countries taking up where Britain is in one of its former colonies, or France or something. The U.S. should step back. Why should both G20 members have the same profile? So.
George.
Yeah, Patrick, like the CSIS study, and I think also the Atlantic Council study, culture was very much a culture, and different systems and different expertise were fundamental to why you can't have an effective merger. And Jim and I can end this on agreeing on PL 480.
I like ending on a note of consensus. And just to say, there are a lot of great ideas that have been discussed. The work has really just begun, because the ideas will come out, and then we'll have to develop a lot of new ideas on how they can be implemented. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this very rich discussion. Thank you so much.